Support for Frontline is provided by U.S. News and World Report.
Trust. For over 70 years, a commitment to playing it straight, getting it right. U.S. News and World Report. Trust matters.
With additional funding from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Ten years ago, in the small East African country of Rwanda, 800,000 people were slaughtered by their own government.
This was ordinary men, women, and children, and the only reason that they were killed was because they were Tutsi.
Virtually the entire world turned away and did almost nothing to stop the genocide.
In retrospect, it all looks very clear, but at the time, what was happening in Rwanda, the situation was unclear.
They cannot tell me that they didn't know. Everybody knew what was happening.
Tonight on Frontline, the full story of perhaps the darkest and most brutal tragedy of our time. It is a story told by the victims and by the killers, by those who turned away and by those who stayed and tried desperately to save as many people as they could.
By the time the genocide was over, I was so angry at America. America the beautiful, America the brave.
They are all still haunted by what happened.
I was the commander, and hundreds of thousands of people died. I can't find any solace in statements like I did my best.
Still haunted by the ghosts of Rwanda.
Rwanda will never, ever leave me. It's in the pores of my body. My soul is in those hills. My spirit is with the spirits of all those people who were slaughtered and killed that I know of. And lots of those eyes still haunt me. Angry eyes or innocent eyes. No laughing eyes. But the worst eyes that haunt me are the eyes of those people who are totally bewildered. They're looking at me with my blue beret, and they're saying, what in the hell happened? How come I'm dying here? Those eyes dominate, and they're absolutely right. How come I failed? How come my mission failed? How come, as the commander, I did not convince, I lost soldiers, and 800,000 people died?
For General Romeo Dallaire, commander of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, it was his first trip to Africa.
You know, the first breath of air of Africa. Oh, what a phenomenal experience. It felt like you were in another continent. It was different. felt a little nervousness, of course, of the first shaking hands with those leaders and starting up the mission.
For Dallaire, a Canadian general who had never seen action, this was the command of a lifetime, a UN peacekeeping mission in the heart of Africa. His job seemed simple. He would enforce a peace agreement between the Rwandan government in Kigali and a rebel army positioned behind a ceasefire line. The rebels were mostly Tutsis, an ethnic minority that had been persecuted for decades.
Some of us had been refugees since 1959. And over the years, in early 60s, in 70s, there had been killings of Tutsis in different parts of Rwanda. So we mainly focused on the very fact that there was need for change in the country and that these stateless people, ourselves, were everywhere in the neighboring countries and beyond, needed to come back home.
The rebel threat had heightened tensions between Tutsis and the ethnic majority, the Hutus. The Hutus had ruled since independence from Belgium in the early 60s. Under the UN-backed peace accord, the Hutus would be forced to share power with the Tutsi rebels. But the peace process was already faltering, even as General Dallaire set up his command center in a rundown Kigali hotel. With only 2,500 lightly armed troops, he was ill-prepared to enforce a fragile peace in a country he did not understand.
We had very, very little information, knowledge of the background to Rwanda, its history, its culture, what had taken place in the country since independence or even before independence, and especially even in the last couple of years. So we went in quite blind.
From the moment he arrived, someone was testing Dallaire's ability to keep the peace. There were mysterious riots and assassinations.
And also, we were already getting all these stories about a third force, of squadrons of killers, and we couldn't confirm anything. We were just getting all that, as rumors, innuendos, and we couldn't cross-check the damn stuff because I was not allowed to have an intelligence capability. So all that sort of came as a dark cloud. Ultimately, I felt we could do it. But that is a bravado, I think, also from my part. Nothing was going to stop me. Bit of innocence in there, eh? Yeah.
Then, from inside the third force, an informant emerged. The informant revealed that a secretive group of Hutu extremists was plotting to derail the peace agreement and exterminate their enemies.
And he was within the higher structures of the MRND party, which was the hardline party of the president. He said that he simply wasn't going to continue to work in that atmosphere, that they were undermining the whole process, and they were ultimately planning the evilest of deeds of attacking not only Tutsis, but all the moderate Hutu leaders also.
The informant was a trainer for the Interahamwe, a paramilitary youth movement. He said they were planning to kill some of Dallaire's troops, Belgian soldiers, the backbone of the peacekeeping force.
Jean-Pierre, the informant, said they felt that if the Belgians were killed, that Belgium and the UN would pack up and leave. So already the situation was changing, that somebody didn't want us there, and that they were going to target us to encourage us to go.
In an urgent cable to the UN leadership, Dallaire repeated the informant's warnings that there was a plan to exterminate all Tutsis in Kigali, that Belgian peacekeepers would also be killed, in the belief that Belgium would then withdraw all its troops. Dallaire told New York he was going to raid the militia's arms caches. He signed off in his native French. Where there's a will, there's a way. Let's go.
I sent that, and then I went to bed and probably slept one of the best nights I had, because I felt that finally we were going to take a certain level of control that would permit us to do so much more.
The cable arrived in New York at the UN's peacekeeping department, then run by Kofi Annan.
The fax came in, and General Dallaire had also been in touch on the phone with General Baril. And in fact, he has sent other messages where sometimes he's questioned that somebody came and gave me this information. I don't know how sincere it is, whether I'm being manipulated or not, because intelligence can also be used to manipulate you.
Annan was skeptical. In his response, he ordered Dallaire, first, not to take any action, and second, to share the informant's secrets with the Rwandan government, which he knew had strong ties to the Hutu extremists.
Why did we go that route? Often shining light on these things and telling those planning it at the governmental level that the international community knows what is being planned. We are monitoring, we are going to deal with you harshly, and we know what you're up to. Sometimes it's a very good deterrent.
Annan told Dallaire he was not to raid the arms caches, and he must avoid any action that might cause UN troops to use force.
The big hammer at the end of the message that came to me within hours of my sending my information message was stop, decease, and by the by, you're totally outside of your mandate. At that time, the whole philosophy was, we don't want another Mogadishu, and so keep it tight.
Mogadishu. 3 months earlier, when the Black Hawks were shot down in Somalia, and 18 American soldiers died on a UN mission, it changed everything about Washington's commitment to peacekeeping, especially in Africa.
The Clinton administration was brought to its knees by the problem in Somalia. A Secretary of Defense was fired, a presidency was dramatically weakened, they were enormously criticized for this adventure in Somalia, and now you had another situation unfolding in Rwanda, and certainly no one was clamoring for a re-intervention into the heart of Africa.
Despite the growing sense of danger, Kigali was teeming with thousands of Western expatriates. Diplomats, aid workers, and their families. The official line from the UN and all their embassies was that Rwanda was still safe.
It was strange because on the one hand, here's little groups of 8 UN soldiers fully decked out, with all of their gear and their machine guns and everything, patrolling the city of 8, and we used to joke, you can't spit without hitting a UN car. And so you got all this white vehicles, black UN all over them, and occasionally you would see some white tanks or something. There was an incredible sense of security in that. And yet we also knew things were going to blow.
Hutu extremists were now confident the UN would not stand in their way. They imported thousands of machetes, prepared death lists, and began targeting their political opponents.
être tout simplement infernal.
It became simply a nightmare for the Tutsis, for all of the members of the opposition parties, even if they were Hutu. And we lived through a series of political assassinations almost on a daily basis.
Presque au quotidien.
Every day God gave us, we had 3, 4, 5 dead bodies. People that we picked up on the streets every day.
And people tried to tell us and tried to explain to us or help us understand, but maybe we just didn't get it. It was just very hard to conceive of something so awful actually being meticulously planned and carried out.
In central Kigali, a group of friends gathered for dinner at the home of a young American diplomat, Laura Lane.
We had a couple friends over, and we just sat down to dinner, and all of a sudden there was a huge explosion, and I didn't instantly, come to me what that was, because I wasn't used to hearing those kinds of sounds.
And then at 8:30, the first phone call came in, saying that originally the first phone call said that there had been a big explosion in Kanombe camp, which is just at the end of the runway of the airfield, the Kigali airfield, saying that it looked like an ammunition dump had exploded.
And it went from there's been an explosion at the airport to we think it's the ammunition dump at Kanombe that's blown up to it's a plane that's crashed to it's the presidential plane that's crashed.
Someone had fired a missile that shot down the Hutu president's airplane. Even 10 years later, the responsibility for the attack remains a mystery.
There are many theories as to who shot down the plane. I don't know if anybody has the answer to that. Was it Hutu extremists or was it Tutsi extremists? Was it done by the Tutsis as an excuse to begin the movement south by the RPF and take control of the country? Hard to say. Or was it used by the Hutu extremists to begin the genocide that took place? I don't know the answer to that.
That night, UN commanders were summoned to a crisis meeting at Rwandan Army headquarters.
We were heading through very darkened streets in Kigali, very quiet streets. There was no one. The streets were just empty. It was like a ghost town.
They found a leading Hutu extremist, Colonel Theoneste Bagosora, in control.
Colonel Bagosora, who was the chef de cabinet of the Minister of National Defense and a hardline person, in fact, considered even more than hardline. He was chairing the meeting.
Bagosora had once vowed to launch an apocalypse against the Tutsis. Dallaire insisted he step aside and hand power to the moderate acting Prime Minister, Madame Agath. Dallaire knew she would resist the extremists' power grab and appeal for calm.
Bagosora kept saying that she is of no use. She never was able to garner her cabinet anyways.
And an officer that was sitting next to me stunk of booze. Started swearing in French underneath his breath about her and calling her various names. And so we were stalemated.
Dallaire asked UN headquarters for guidance. They responded by tightening his rules of engagement. He was ordered not to intervene, and above all, to avoid armed conflict.
We were concerned, one, that Dallaire and his force didn't have the capacity and didn't to take on that sort of responsibility, and that if they attempted to do it and any of the peacekeepers were killed, we may see a repeat of Somalia, and we may not even be able to offer any assistance.
You heard gunshots, you heard screams, you heard just so much activity that you knew this was going to be, an awful night. And in the darkness, you were just, I remember feeling like, I don't want the daylight to come because I don't want to see, knowing what I'm hearing.
Well, what's going on here, huh? We got all the kids in the hallway and the television. This is April 7. It's about 6 o'clock in the morning, and we were woken up at about 5:15, 5:20 by a lot of gunfire and stuff.
Yeah, the killing was happening right there. Our kids were listening in. While they're describing on the radio, and I'm talking back to them and saying how people are being killed in their front yard, and I'm saying we're trying to get help, and we're just trying to figure out what we can do. This whole drama's unfolding, and our kids are standing there glued to this thing, and all of a sudden I go, whoa, I see, one of them standing there and just transfixed, and I say, Teresa, take them away.
That morning, Dallaire sent Belgian and Ghanaian peacekeepers to guard Madame Agath, the moderate prime minister. Then he went to find the extremist leadership.
Agath was getting all the protection she needed, at least we expected it needed. I mean, they ended up by having 25 troops there. With that sort of in hand, my job now, because I was moving around, is to go get a hold of Baghassar and say, okay, what's going on now? What is the situation? Roadblocks were coming up. But as I got closer to the inner core of the city, the roadblocks became more serious, and ultimately the roadblocks in that inner circle there was controlled by the Presidential Guard. And so we made our way to the Ministry of Defense. Nobody was there. So I said, well, maybe they're right back to where they were last night. So just turned and went towards the SM.
As Dallaire looked for the extremist leaders, the Prime Minister's house was surrounded by Rwandan troops. Inside, UN peacekeepers sent to protect her were under orders not to use force. The Prime Minister called her neighbor, American diplomat Joyce Leader.
About 8:30 in the morning, she called and asked if she could come and hide in my house.
The Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister. And I didn't give it very much thought, and I said yes. But then when the Ghanaian peacekeeper who was guarding her, he must have put a ladder up on her side of the fence, and he came up he raised his head above the fence, and there were shots fired just then.
Rwandan troops stormed the Prime Minister's compound. The peacekeepers radioed for instructions from Dallaire's Ghanaian deputy.
We were in communication with them all along, and it was not even rational for them to try to oppose them. The best they could do was to talk to them, to negotiate, to tell them, look, what you're about to do is wrong, you cannot do it.
At gunpoint, the UN troops surrendered their weapons to the Rwandans. The Ghanaian peacekeepers were soon released, but the 10 Belgian troops were taken hostage and led away.
Their radios became silent. Then you suspected something had gone wrong because communication was suddenly cut off. Then you sense a danger. Something must have happened.
About another half hour later, we actually heard a scream and a shot and realized that it was the Prime Minister who had been found and killed.
General Dallaire hadn't heard of the attack, but he'd learned the extremist leadership was meeting at Army headquarters. As he approached, Dallaire caught a glimpse of his soldiers inside the Army compound, lying in the dirt.
And at the gate, as we went by, I saw two soldiers in a Belgian uniform lying on the ground about 50-odd meters inside the camp. And so your whole life is dependent on those nanoseconds of taking that right decisions, because it's life and death. I was already saying, I can't get those guys out of there. I just don't have the forces or the deployment capability. I've got so many other troops that I don't know of, and all the vulnerability of the rest. I can't take these bastards on. To do anything for them and for the others, I had to negotiate.
Dallaire carried on through the next gate to confront the extremist leadership. But he decided not to mention his troops, who he knew were being beaten 200 yards away.
What I said was, get a grip of your units. I'm staying. The informant, Jean-Pierre, had told us that they were trying to set up to wipe out a dozen or so, or 10 Belgians, in order to break the back of our mission, because if the Belgians pulled out, I had no real substantive capability to sustain myself, and that the international community would pull us all out. These guys knew about Mogadishu also. And so what I was making clear to them was that I'm staying.
Dallaire later demanded to know what had happened to the Belgians, but he took no military action to rescue his troops.
Finally, a phone call after insistence came and said that they are all at the hospital, at the morgue. And so I said, right, let's go. The morgue was a little shack, and a bit of an L-shaped small shack. And there was a 25-watt bulb at best. And there in the corner of the L shape was this pile of potato bags. Just looked like a pile of big, huge potato bags. And as we got closer, we saw that they were bodies.
In the wake of Somalia, the murder of more Western peacekeepers triggered an immediate response.
Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to start with the situation in Rwanda. The President called the Secretary of State this morning to express the President's concern about the safety of Americans in Rwanda in light of the deteriorating situation there.
By that morning, we kind of had a sense that we were not going to be able to wait this out. I took our wedding album, we took our guns, and put the dog at our feet and literally slumped down in the car and drove down the streets, like just looking over the dashboard, you know, as we hear fire in the background, and made it to the embassy.
The Clinton administration ordered an immediate evacuation of all 257 U.S. citizens in Rwanda. It was up to Laura Lane to get every American out alive.
We said we have to, evacuate the American community out because we couldn't risk, their lives trying to wait this out, because if this was a plan, it had a larger purpose, and that larger purpose would not be good where you'd want anyone in harm's way.
But Lane told Washington she wanted to stay and keep the embassy open as a safe haven for Rwandans.
I felt very, very strongly that if there is someone who is planning this kind of evil, They need to know that there is also another group, that we, the Americans, will stand right here and stand against them. And I felt very, very strongly about that, because otherwise they think they could get away with it.
Yeah, I do recall there was the notion that, yes, maybe we could stay behind and maybe we could do something. But then you have to say, with what do you create a safe haven? If the Belgian troops could not defend and protect the Prime Minister from a ruthless attack, what were unarmed Americans bearing a flag going to do?
Maybe hopelessly naive. I mean, we were 4 people in an embassy, and very small embassy community. But I don't know, I think one person can make a difference, and maybe if we just saved one life, that was one life worth saving. Maybe we couldn't save everyone, but I would have rather stood there and said, and stayed and said, I am going to stay because it is worth that risk. So, in the end, the decision was taken out of my hands.
All embassies in Kigali closed. Aid workers and diplomats were ordered out of the country.
We started going out, picking up our military observers who were at various locations, picking up our UN staff, picking up diplomats, picking up people at risk. And we started a whole series of what we call rescue missions to go pick people up, try to locate them.
Beardsley went to rescue Polish Catholic priests trapped with 2 UN observers in a Kigali church where Tutsis had sought refuge.
The military observers and the priests could hear people screaming over the church, so they'd left their quarters and had come over to see what was going on. They were grabbed and they were put up against the wall with a rifle underneath their chin, and they were held there while the identity cards were captured, were burned. And then the militia came in, and the gendarmes the police literally handed them over to the militia, who then proceeded through the rest of the evening to chop them apart with machetes. Inside the church itself were about 150 people. About 15 of them were still alive. The rest had been attacked with machetes and had been killed. And the thing that stood out in my mind up until that day, it almost bore the resemblance of a coup, taking out the moderates. But this was different. This was just ordinary men, women, and children, and the only reason whatsoever that they were killed and targeted was because they were Tutsi.
Behind the ceasefire line, the Tutsi rebels of the Rwandan Patriotic Front were preparing to respond.
The information very clearly came in very fast, showing how targeted killings were being carried out and how these were spreading out, not only in Kigali, but going beyond Kigali to other parts of the country. And we knew that was the usual style. The massacres had started. And we have to take action.
The rebels declared the peace process dead and attacked the extremist government. General Kagame had gone through training at Fort Leavenworth. The U.S. military maintained contact and understood the rebel leaders' intentions.
In retrospect, there was no chance, I think, that the RPF was in any mood to negotiate right from the beginning.
They wanted what?
They wanted to take control of the country. They wanted to take over control politically, militarily. There was no way you're going to stop the RPF. There was no way that they were in the mood to negotiate once this all started.
Overnight, 1,000 French and Belgian paratroopers had arrived without warning, seizing Kigali airport. These troops were not under UN command. Their mission was solely to get the expatriates out. Dozens of journalists had arrived with the new troops. They traveled with Belgian soldiers to Kigali's psychiatric hospital, where the Western staff was trapped. On the way in, they drove past the Interahamwe, waiting outside. Tutsis emerged from the hospital building, where they'd been hiding for 3 days. They said they were surrounded by the militias, that some of them had already been killed.
Depuis 3 jours, il y a déjà des cadavres là-dedans.
When it was clear the soldiers weren't going to help, the refugees appealed to the journalists.
It was a whole group of people, but in the whole group, one woman started to speak and started to explain why they were afraid and what was happening to them. And she started begging us to take her and the others with us. She was speaking to me, a woman to a woman, saying, "I'm afraid, please help me." Yeah, we were just listening to her, and then we couldn't do anything. At that moment, we thought we couldn't do anything, just listen and say yes. So we left. For the white people, it's over. Between you, the hundreds that stayed. And we heard the shooting at the moment we left. So it was clear for me that hell starts for them.
All Western troops and UN peacekeepers were under orders not to evacuate ordinary Rwandans.
What that meant was anybody that was white-skinned got to get on an airplane and fly to safety, and anybody that was black-skinned got to stay in Rwanda and get killed. And that's as simple as it came down to. It still to this day leaves a very, very bad taste in my mouth that the United States of America could have 350 Marines sitting at Bujumbura Airport, that the French were able to get in 500 or so paratroopers, that the Belgians had over 1,000 paratroopers. You know, we basically had our intervention force already on the ground. You know, what they later told us, it was impossible to get on the ground. We had it on the ground on the 10th of April, within 3 days of this thing starting. And, but it wasn't there to intervene. It wasn't there to save Rwandans. It was there to save white people. And that's what it came down to.
With the airport taking fire, the American embassy decided to evacuate its staff and expatriates overland in convoys south to Burundi, where U.S. Marines were waiting.
And there were people standing on either side of the road. And it's my recollection that I saw some instruments like machetes in their hands. And I remember thinking, well, they're just waiting for us to get out of here and before they go on about their gruesome business.
I was working for the American embassy, basically. I saw them leaving. I saw the flags and the vehicles. I know all the vehicles, I know all the peoples they belong to, and so on. So I said, okay. I think it was sad, surprising to see that by the end of the day, you are a person who has to die, when other people are allowed to be alive. This is a strange feeling. Americans were allowed to be alive. My neighbors were allowed to be alive. They were walking on the street, they were going to the market. And we were here feeling that we had to die anyway.
As she organized the last American convoy, Laura Lane made a final attempt to do what she thought was right.
We had a convoy of over 100 vehicles with over 600 people, only 9 Americans. Greg and I were the last 2. The ambassador was at the front. And yes, there were Rwandans in there. There were Tutsis in there, and in some cases there were Hutus. And so if they made it to our checkpoints and we could hide them, we did. Some of them were, we dubbed them Americans for the day. You know what I mean? We made them honorary Americans so that they could be in the convoy.
If people in Rwanda ever needed help, now was the time. And everybody's leaving.
Carl Wilkins had put his family on an American convoy, but he decided to stay behind with Rwandan colleagues and workers who'd sought refuge in his home.
That Tutsi young lady and that Tutsi young man were faces right there to me representing the country, and I felt if I left, they were going to be killed. And then I recognized, how is it? I got this blue American passport. That means I can go, but all of these people don't have a passport. They can't go. And while all of those things played in, the bottom line is it just seemed the right thing to do.
By the evening of April 10th, Carl Wilkins was the only American left in Rwanda.
As far as I know, everyone in Kigali who's wanted to leave has been able to leave, and they're probably successfully out by now, safely out by now. Thanks very much.
The Clinton administration breathed a sigh of relief. In Belgium, the country was in crisis. With 10 of its soldiers dead, the government wanted to pull all its peacekeepers out of Rwanda. But it didn't want to be embarrassed by leaving alone. The foreign minister called Secretary of State Warren Christopher.
The reaction of the public opinion in Belgium was very strong, and I may say there was unanimity in order to ask to pull out the troops after the killing. Warren Christopher told me that he understood perfectly why the Belgian government took that decision. He confirmed that the preference of the Americans went to the withdrawal of the Minuar.
Quite clearly, the Belgians wanted to have a cover of having others leave as well, I think, and we did. We yielded to that request. In retrospect, I wonder if that was the right thing to do.
Christopher instructed Madeleine Albright, America's ambassador at the UN, to push for the withdrawal of the entire peacekeeping force.
My instructions were to support full withdrawal. And I listened to the discussion very carefully in the Security Council, and I could see that our position was wrong, and especially in listening to the African delegate, Ambassador Gambari from Nigeria, was very moving on this.
And I had the full backing of my colleagues to argue on the contrary, that we must forget about cutting and running, that it will be callous, it will be contradictory to the spirit of the Charter, which says Security Council has a responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security everywhere in the world, including Africa.
And I asked my deputy to take my seat while I left and went out into the hall, into these phone booths, and called Washington. And they said, well, no, we're worrying about this, and these are your instructions. And I actually screamed into the phone. I said, they're unacceptable. I want them changed.
Albright's call was to Richard Clark, head of peacekeeping at the National Security Council. Clark declined to talk to Frontline, but he did talk to journalist Samantha Power.
and they end up in a screaming match. The fight is not about whether to send U.S. troops to Rwanda. That's not even contemplated. The fight is simply about how to withdraw the UN peacekeepers and how many to withdraw and how many to leave in place and what the function of those peacekeepers should be who remain in place. That's what the fight is about. That's the extent of the dissent at the highest level of the U.S. government about this genocide. That's it. That phone call.
With the United States demanding a withdrawal, the UN instructed General Dallaire to start closing down his peacekeeping mission. Dallaire turned to his deputy, General Henry Aniadoho, for advice.
And I remember sitting in front of his desk, huge man sitting there, stoic. And I said, Henry, they want us out. We've failed in the mission. We've failed in attempting to convince. We failed the Rwandans. We are going to run and cut the losses. That's what they want us to do.
And I said, no, we haven't failed. And as commanders, we are going to sit here, work hard, and see to its solution. So let's tell those people back in New York that we do not think that the mission should be closed.
Aniadoho assured Dallaire his Ghanaian peacekeepers would stay.
And that was all I needed. That meant that I would still have troops on the ground, which were good troops, not well equipped, but good troops. So I stood up and I said, Henry, we're not going to run. We're not going to abandon the mission. And we will not be held in history of being accountable for the abandonment of the Rwandan people. It was just morally corrupt to do that. And that's when I went back and told them to go to hell.
As the UN debated whether to keep a peacekeeping force in Kigali, the extremist Hutu leadership implemented the next phase of its plan: to spread the killing across the nation by exploiting Rwanda's culture of obedience. They told Hutus the Tutsi rebels were foreign invaders, bent on turning them into slaves. Their propaganda reminded Hutus that the Tutsis had ruled them for centuries, often treating them with disdain.
Tutsis used to abuse Hutus. For example, if a Tutsi chief wished to stand up from his chair, he would call up a Hutu who would allow his foot to be pierced by the Tutsi's spear as he stood up. My understanding is that Tutsis are not originally from Rwanda. I heard that they might have come from Egypt or somewhere else.
An extremist hate radio station told Hutus to eliminate their Tutsi neighbors.
Then, when the war began, people changed. One day across the valley, we saw houses burning and people fleeing from their homes.
A 12-year-old girl named Valentina followed her parents into the Catholic Church in Nyirabuye, where along with more than 5,000 other Tutsis, they waited. It was April the 15th.
I was a young girl. My parents thought the church was safe because no one will be killed in a church. When we arrived, I could see the older people were very sad and upset. Everybody was scared, but nobody knew what was going to happen.
The leader of the local community told us that Tutsis had fled to Nyaruye and that we had to go there and kill them. On the morning of April 15th, we woke up and started walking towards the church. It was like going to the marketplace.
I saw the soldiers come in, and they started shooting and shooting. All we had to defend ourselves were rocks. Then our local governor, Gachumbitsi, came in and stood in front of us. Gachumbitsi said that everyone should know what they were there for. He said that all those who were there should be killed, that no one should survive. Then they started killing, hacking with their machetes. They kept doing it, and I was hiding under dead people. They didn't kill me because of the blood covering me. They thought they had killed me.
It was as if we were taken over by Satan. When Satan is using you, you lose your mind. We were not ourselves. You couldn't be normal and you start butchering people for no reason. We had been attacked by the devil.
It was very late, around 2 a.m. when the Interahamwe came back. One of them stepped on my head. He was shaking me with his foot to see if I was alive. He said, "This thing is dead," and so they left. I lived among the dead for a long time. At night, the dogs would come to eat the bodies. Once a dog was eating someone next to me. I threw something at the dog and he ran away. I hid in a small room. That's where I stayed and slept for 43 days.